I've been working with trees for about 15 years now. I started working in Orville, getting involved in reforestation projects. So the establishment of woodlands, or here forests, we call them, and eventually the maintenance of those forests. And this got me involved in arboriculture. So this is the study of trees, because I wanted to prune the trees that we use here as pioneer species, which is the Acacia auriculaeformis. It's a species that produces good wood for furniture, except it usually produces very short bits of wood. So there are angles that occur quite quickly, so you end up with only pieces of wood that are maybe 2, 3, 4 meters long. But I thought if we could prune these trees, then we could get better pieces of timber when they die, because they're trees that are very short-lived. And so you can use those trees to generate income to be able to plant more forests, essentially. So that's how I got into pruning trees, and eventually it evolved into pruning more trees and setting up co-founding Tree Care, which is a unit in Orville which is still going, which I'm no longer part of directly, but I'm associated with. And then eventually it got me into working in the UK, getting a diploma, getting involved in tree inspections, assessments, and providing advice on construction sites wherever there would be a tree and structure or construction conflict. So this is kind of what I'm doing now. And the reason for this presentation is because here in Orville and in many parts of the world, there's not enough dialogue between the city builders and the foresters, essentially. And what is important to do, in my mind, is to show engineers and city planners the benefits that trees have that will apply to systems that they are trying to put into place. So I'll go through that in here, but basically it's trying to really open a dialogue between the foresters, the die-hard foresters, and the die-hard city planners. So that's kind of the idea here. Hello. So this presentation, the idea is that it's as unbiased as possible. I really tried not to show a sort of tree-hugging quality, because I find that it doesn't work at all with city planners. So what I'm trying to do is really bring in metrics, and so that people can actually see, and I'll show you the values of trees, but in a monetary form as well, because that's how people can translate the value of something these days. So it doesn't mean that's the only way that I value trees. It's just the way that I can communicate this to other people, which otherwise would not be able to understand. At least that's one idea. Are we good to go?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, let's start. Sorry, we've just been waiting for this. Let's see. So, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the Unity Pavilion. And also I want to thank Rao from Elixir Technologies, who's in Bangalore, who was not able to attend today, but he's actually donated money to pay for the rental of this equipment and the space. So it's quite a nice gesture. He deals with survey equipment for forestry projects and also for trees. So I'm working along with him a bit. So, trees in urban spaces. What I mean by that is trees in private gardens, government premises, or just public spaces. So parks, schools, roadsides, that sort of thing. Right. So the first thing I'll talk about will be the benefits. It's important to know that trees are affecting us and the environment in many different ways, so social, all of these different effects. And there's often overlaps between the different effects. What I'll be talking about today is obviously not an exhaustive list, but it gives a good idea, and I'm trying to really bring out the major benefits, but also the drawbacks, which I'll be talking about as well. So we'll start with the benefits. The first thing to take into consideration is that trees do not provide benefits until they reach a certain maturity. And this means also that if we plant trees and 10 years later we change our mind and chop them down, or they get damaged and are no longer there, then we've wasted time. Essentially, we've planted something, we've invested in something, and it's been a waste of everybody's time. So this is a graph that comes from the UK. It's Jeremy Barrell is one of the top consultants in the UK in arboriculture. And this is what he's come up with because of conflicts that have happened in numerous cities where trees were chopped down prematurely, basically. And he was just trying to show, like, we need to keep trees alive for as long as possible so we get as many benefits as we can. Because we're using taxpayers' money also. So this is the first benefit that I think everybody is aware of, is that trees reduce temperatures. This is an infrared camera shot, which actually shows you directly how much they do that. So you've got a 20-degree difference between tarmac area with under the trees. You definitely feel it. It's a huge, huge difference. And how this works as well is through the transpiration. So evapotranspiration is where the water that's taken up into the trees is used to make photosynthesis, to do the photosynthesis process. And when that happens, you've got a water in liquid form, which turns into a gaseous form, and this pulls in the heat from the surrounding area. So it cools the immediate vicinity. So here we've got shade, which is obviously helping us to get less skin cancer, for example. It's cooling the surroundings, so in comparison to ACs, for example, it's a much more efficient system because it's only cooling down, whereas ACs do a very good job of cooling in a very determinate space, but they're actually creating heat to do this. So overall, the more ACs we're putting in, the more heat we're generating, whereas here we're just cooling the area down. Here's a street everybody here will be familiar with, I imagine. Another thing they bring about is they increase the air quality. So they do that by catching the particulates, the pollution particulates. So for example, from motorcycles or cars, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, that sort of thing. And they're improving the quality of the air by adding oxygen to it. So one way you can say that this benefits, for example, a municipal corporation economically, is that you have less people that are suffering from respiratory diseases. So you've got less people in the hospitals, you've got less costs involved. Sorry. The other thing that trees do is that they reduce the speed of traffic. So they do that when they're close to the road, but also when they're closely spaced. And what this does is basically it makes lines that are in this direction, which they don't exactly know. I mean, the people that have done this research don't know exactly why people slow down, or for example, birds have also been tested, they'll slow down, but it can bring about quite a significant reduction in speed. And obviously, less speed, less pollution, less accidents, everybody is a winner. This was taken this week. So green corridors, what we're doing when we're planting trees along roads that touch at the top is that you're able to make a bridge. So you're increasing the habitat and the environment of different microorganisms. So for example, this chameleon, if it had that, then it wouldn't have had to go onto the street and get run over. So it's a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but it illustrates a point basically. The more trees we have in densely planted all over the place, the more habitats we're creating. Water management is a huge issue nowadays. We've got a huge water crisis on our hands. Trees have been shown to deal with, to improve water management significantly, to help engineers to be able to slow down the volume of water that's going into a storm management system, but also and therefore to reduce the runoff that would otherwise be eroding, in some case, pollutants going into rivers, lakes. So the first way that trees slow down the water is by intercepting it, and they do that on their leaves. So each leaf has a certain surface area, and because there's so many leaves on trees, they catch so much water, which means you really have a huge change in the volume of water that's going directly into your sewer system or stormwater system or stormwater catchment system. So you need to spend less to be able to have these systems in place. Reduced through falls, that's the water that's slowed down as it goes through the tree, so it's not hitting the ground as hard, so there's less compaction, which means it's able to percolate more easily. And obviously, this increased infiltration is also done through the growth of the roots and the less direct impact that the sun has on the ground, which means that you have more microorganisms growing in there, which are also, such as worms, for example, which are burrowing and making holes in the soil, which allows the water to percolate. So we're increasing the percolation rate. Also through the evapotranspiration, so the water is being pulled up by the tree and it's being evaporated. So there's less water at one time in the ground. It's less saturated with water, which means there's less chance of the water running off from that area. Finally, phytoremediation with regards to, again, air pollutants. Any pollutants that are caught in the water, which is then absorbed by the tree, some of them are broken down and used by the tree. And so this avoids pollutants going into, again, rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. And these are all significant amounts. So obviously, trees create habitats. Here I've just put a picture of a tree with a cavity inside. Every cavity that a tree has generally has something living in it. So we're improving the homes, the spaces that these organisms can live in. We're providing nesting materials, we're providing food, such as pollen, nectar, for a myriad of different fauna. Some trees fix nitrogen, which will help other trees grow and plants. Not all trees fix nitrogen. This is a market space in France. A picture that I took when I was there. So the practice that's done on those trees is called pollarding. It's not something I advocate, it's definitely not something I would recommend, but it's what's been done in France, and France and the UK are quite famous for this sort of thing. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the trees are softening the landscape. So it's no longer just a hardscape, a grey infrastructure, they're softening the landscape, which means that there are people that will be more inclined to stay longer in a place. And if you're selling stuff there, you can have people that will congregate there, so they'll spend more time there. They'll also be willing to spend more money. And so people can charge more. Trees provide work. This was me a few years ago, cutting down a tree that had fallen into another tree that was unsafe, essentially. So yes, we want more trees because we'll get more work, obviously, but there are a lot of ways that trees and tree management will employ many other people as well. So it provides a lot of work to people. And obviously we get wood from trees. And what that does is obviously it sequesters the carbon that has grown in the tree as wood, which nowadays is quite an important factor in many projects. And anything that you keep as wood for a long time, it means you're making sure that carbon doesn't go back into the atmosphere. So it's something that's actually really important to do, I think. And obviously we can do a lot of things with that wood. We can make furniture, we can make houses, we can make toys, all sorts of things which can last generations, hundreds, thousands of years in some cases. In some places in the world, we've got urban timber banks that are basically using the urban trees. So they're, instead of just taking the trees from the forest or plantations, basically you're using the trees that are easily accessible, so they're right next to roads. You can have really big trees that have been really well maintained, and those trees will be your urban timber bank. So we get a lot more timber from that, and that's not to be overlooked. One of the big things that trees bring about is they increase trees and green spaces. Often it's the case, it's green spaces as well, or it's both. They increase the rate at which patients recover. So somebody in a hospital will recover faster if they've got access to a green space compared to somebody who doesn't. And this has been proven over and over again. What does this mean? You're spending less time in the hospital, which is always a good thing. You're spending less money. And if the state is paying for it, they're spending less money. The hospitals don't need to be as big. Yes, it's a benefit for everybody. Less stress has also been associated with green spaces, quite significant. Less stress, people are happier, people are able to work better. We're getting more work done, more productive. Generally, it's less stress. I think nobody can complain with having less stress. Concentration rates of students has been observed. So there was a study done with over 300 schools in the US, comparing schools with access to green spaces and schools without access to green spaces. And there was a significant increase in concentration rates and results basically from the ones with the access to the green spaces. So it affects us in a lot of ways that we don't necessarily see, but once we start doing the research, we can really quantify all this. And the research is there, and I'm happy to share any references with anything I'm saying today with whoever is interested. So I can't quantify this, I can't tell you that trees actually beautify things, but I think a lot of people will agree with this. So trees can be used to beautify things. They're really interesting bark, beautiful flowers. They provide food also, mangoes, whatnot. Trees can be used to frame things. So for example, I only wanted to see the structures inside the lawns there. I didn't really want to see the building in the background. So they can be used to frame, they can be used to conceal things that we don't want to see. Not so relevant in Orville, but trees increase property values quite significantly, 10 to 15% in some cases, more in affluent locations, but quite significant. It's been proven that it's cheaper or more economically viable to retain the trees that are retainable on a development site and protect them during the development rather than cutting everything down and putting new trees in or transplanting big trees in. It's cheaper to do it first, even though it might seem more complicated. And obviously you'll get higher rental income if you've got trees in a property that you're renting, similarly to the property value of the trees. So here's a sort of a breakdown of how much the state of Indiana is saving per year because of its street trees. This is just street trees. This is not to do with park trees or trees in private individuals' houses or in schools or that sort of thing. It's just to give an idea. So this data corroborates with data from other states in the US, just to say that it's not just a one-off thing. And I'll tell you how we get to this in a few slides. So 52%, just to go through it so it's a bit more clear. There's the aesthetics or other. This is mainly property values and also the social aspect. So with regards to the spending less time in the hospital, being less stressed, having students that are performing better. So it's a huge amount. The next one is stormwater catchment. So there's less erosion, there's less damage, there's less infrastructure that's required to deal with water, stormwater. The next one is what? Energy. So the energy is with regards, for example, to ACs, less use of AC. In some cases, there's 30% less use of cooling apparatus because of trees. But also to take into consideration, for example, if you've got if you work in one place and you live in another place, you'll be much more likely to take a bicycle or walk to that place if it's a tree-lined street rather than a fully exposed street where you would want to rather take a car and put your AC on, that sort of thing. So there's quite a significant saving from that. Finally, we've got air quality, respiratory diseases, that sort of thing, and CO2, so carbon sequestration, how much it's sequestering per year. There's actually tree return on investments that have been calculated. The first one is from iTree, which I'm just about to talk about. And the second one is from Natural England, which is the UK's consulting body for the environment. So they advise the UK government on any environmental issues, basically. So that's 7 to 20 times that they're stating. A lot of it is indirectly, but the first figure is directly. So, yeah. So they've worked out, for example, the first figure is worked out with these guys. iTree is a set of tools that has been developed by David Nowak, who's headed who's part of the USDA Forest Service research. And it's something that's been used in many parts of the world and in many cities, for example, New York and London, to quantify the benefits that trees provide to those cities. So how much are they, for example, I showed you the graph on Indiana. This is how they're getting this information. They're based on their pollution levels, based on their rainfall, based on the climate, based on the species, they're coming up with these figures. There are many different tools that are available. All these tools are free. Some of them are applicable here, some of them are not, because we don't have the data, for example, with regards to pollution levels, types of pollutants, that sort of thing in the cities. So they're all going in different directions, the tools, basically. They're all based around trees, obviously. This is what it kind of looks, what one of them looks like. This is iTree Canopy. So you define an area using this. It's in your web browser, basically. You define an area, and you say if you give a different, for example, at the top here you see tree and non-tree. So these are the only two data figures that I've put in. And what it does is it just puts a crosshair on a Google image, basically, within this defined area. And all you've got to say is whether there's a tree there or not. And after a certain amount of clicks, you get an idea of what sort of canopy cover you've got. And what this gives you in the end, if you've got the correct, for example, at the bottom here we've got, these are all air quality, how they're improving the air quality. So here you would potentially get these sorts of figures per year. So this is in Indian rupees, but obviously this is not usable because we don't have the data from India already in this tool. But so this is using the US data on pollution levels. It can give you a lot of information. So that was all the good stuff. There are some drawbacks to trees, as a lot of people will know. The first one is they decrease property values. So in the same way that they can increase them, if you end up with a tree of this sort, for example, I've given a picture of a tree that has very poor structural, is in a very poor structural state, and health-wise it's also not doing well. Basically, there'll be a lot of costs involved. If you were to sell a property with a tree like that on it, you would be losing money, or you wouldn't be able to sell your property before you would take it down, basically. So it's a two-edged sword, obviously. So there can be a lot of costs associated with trees, and I'll talk about how we can reduce those costs later on, basically with proper management. We have big damage and people killed from trees, obviously. This was in the UK a few years ago. The tree had been inspected, but you know, there's always a potential for that to happen. Here it only smashed a few cars. It obviously could have been much worse. On the top left, you can see that's basically a nursery or a school for small kids. You don't want to imagine what would have happened there. So, I mean, there are, you know, it's all fine and good to say we need more trees, we want to plant more trees, but we need to make sure that we don't just plant anything and we manage it properly. Because you can get really big disasters of that sort. Trees can also obstruct views. They can be trip hazards, they can be impediments. So here we have a really good tree that's sort of illustrating everything there. You can hardly walk under it despite the footpath being there. The road is being encroached on. There's possibly a sign behind that you can't see. So there are a lot of issues with this particular tree in this case. Trees can create a mess. Here we've got mango trees that are dropping mangoes all over the place. And obviously associated with that we've got smell, we've got flies, we've got aphids, we have potentially also dead branches. We'll have birds that are nesting in there, or not necessarily in this picture, but in trees, and pooping on cars, on people, whatever. So there's trees that are associated more with this sort of stuff, and trees that are less associated with that. Here it's a picture of a mistletoe, which is a parasitic plant that grows on quite a number of trees. It's a local parasite here. Some trees attract parasites a lot more than other trees. And what happens there is that you will end up bringing in more of these parasites, which then makes it easier for that parasite to colonize other trees and plants. So trees that would be less susceptible to these parasites are suddenly being affronted with this, and they'll have to deal with it. So this is just a plant parasite, but there are also fungi, there are bacteria that can be associated with this and insects. So that was a few drawbacks. Hopefully it's covered the more obvious drawbacks. So the idea is, can we improve matters? So yes, obviously. So one of them is the proactive management of existing trees. So what we already have is a huge asset, and we really don't want to lose that asset or turn it into a liability. So one of the ways we do this, or I do this as well, is through inspections or surveys of trees. What this gives you, for example, is it shows you what's around on the trees that you have here. Here I've got a picture of a fungus fruiting body. So it's essentially the flower of a fungus, or a mushroom is also a flower of a fungus. And this just shows that there is a fungus inside the tree. It's not actually the fungus, it's just the flower. So it's just, there's a whole host that's in there. And when you start inspecting trees, you start noticing trends. And for example, in the UK, I had an app which told me which hosts were susceptible to which fungi and what those fungi did, so whether I should worry or not. In India, I'm kind of starting from scratch. So if we're inspecting trees, we're sort of cataloging what there is and trying to see what those effects are in the long term, because we don't have this information yet. So this goes with fungi, this goes with bacteria, with other pests, and we can identify if there are pathogens that are coming through that are going to be killing a lot of these trees at once, that sort of thing. We can also plan, sorry I forgot one thing, we can also, based on what we inspect, we can see what sort of work is required to the trees that we have. If there is any work, which means that we can plan a budget for that work. So we can plan for the future, basically. But it has to be done right. We can't just... One of the problems with inspecting trees, with starting to inspect trees, is that you'll notice a lot more stuff because you're looking a lot more. And so you end up with a lot more trees being cut down because, in some cases, because people are afraid or, I don't know, can't inspect properly. So one of the things that's identified when you're inspecting trees is whether a tree needs to be pruned or not. And if you identify that earlier on, then you do smaller pruning cuts to trees. And that's very important. If you do a bigger pruning cut, so for example here, this is a pretty good pruning cut as far as pruning is concerned, but it was about this big. And this tree has other ailments, so it has other factors that are reducing its health, and therefore what you've got in there is you've got a fungus that's gone inside where it's been cut, that's now colonizing this tree, so it's becoming, it's turning into subsequent damage. So you've got first damage from the pruning cut, and then you've got damage from the fungus, and then you have potential damage from cracks which will occur because the tree has been weakened. And basically, in some cases, you're condemning the tree because of your pruning cut, whether it was a good pruning cut or bad. So we'll identify when to prune, how much to prune, and does it even need pruning. A lot of trees don't actually need pruning. People think that we need to prune trees to keep them healthy, to maintain them. That's not always the case. And in many cases, you're worsening the situation. Surveying trees, inspecting them, will identify trees that need to be removed because, for example, here it's dead. It's been dead for a while. It needs to be removed. There's no reason why this tree right next to a road, very busy road, should stay there. And when we identify that, then we can say, okay, that's where we need to remove the tree so we can replant a tree. So we're not wasting time, we're not losing time where there's a tree that could have been potentially growing for 3 years, in some cases more. So that was the inspecting the trees that are there. Planning together. This is something that I'm constantly battling with, basically. This is sort of the work that I do. This is a development site, and you can see there's already a drawing of a building there. So we've been called in to identify the trees on the land, to give a retention category to them to see how good they are, basically, whether they're really important trees, we should keep them, they're not so rare, or they're very young, or they've got lots of problems. So this is what I'm giving, except, and the first bit here, the first plan is unbiased towards anything that's being built on the land. So basically I've not taken into consideration the building. But that's kind of the problem. The building's already been designed. So this is sort of damage control. It's not, ideally, we would have come before any sort of design. This is showing what's been decided between the clients and the architects and ourselves. So which trees are going to be removed and which ones are going to stay based on the scheme. So what's actually going to happen on the land, and how will the trees that are retained affect the building, and how will the building affect the trees. There's one tree that we could transplant, and it's the only one that we went for transplanting. Because it's based on the condition, but also the type of tree. Right? And finally, we want to protect the trees that are to be retained. So this is just this is what we're left with, basically, and how we're going to be protecting those trees during the construction, so that we're not left with trees that are damaged during the construction, which then become a liability again. So that's just to give an idea of how we're planning together and how the situation usually is. We're called in after, or I'm called in after a plan's already been there. We're actually, what we need to do, and what I'm going to illustrate with this, is plan the green infrastructure before the grey infrastructure. Because then we can actually put the green infrastructure in the space that it needs. And we can actually, both sides will work hand in hand. This is, for me, a good illustration of a very short-term plan. I don't know who made it, but we've got a metal structure which has been erected here to protect the bikes. Sorry. And if it's for the rain, I mean, you're on a bike, you're going to get wet if it's raining. If it's for the shade, it's not really shading the bikes really well. The east is on that side, so the sun's coming in on that side. My main gripe here is that the whole foundation here has been built on top of the roots of these neem trees. So we've got a whole row of assets, essentially on the left side, which are shading the potential bikes and that sort of thing, which have been completely neglected. And there's a structure that's been put there that somewhat performs a function. But if we would have planted more trees and spent money on putting in big trees on this side, for example, then we would have been shading this whole area a lot more. And also we wouldn't be left with this huge amount of runoff that's coming from there and exposing the soil directly to the sun and to the rain. So we're going to get a really muddy condition and really hard soil, which will just create runoff here. So it's just a really simple example of where we really should be planning with the green before. We could have put this structure there, but we really should have done it in a different manner. This is an example of what happens when you put earth close to the trees to the roots of a tree. So here you can, it's not a great picture, but you've got a mound of earth here that's been put next to a neem tree, so the same type of tree that was in the last picture. And basically what you're doing here is you're stopping the oxygen from reaching the roots. Trees need oxygen to breathe, just like we do, so they need it to use the energy, and they need it to maintain their system and to grow their system. When you're putting earth on the ground, you're stopping the amount of oxygen that can reach the ground. Most of the oxygen goes down to 60 centimeters, more or less. It really depends on the soil type, but most tree roots are in the top 60 centimeters because of that. And you're also compacting the soil when you're putting in a certain amount of weight on it. And what that does is it closes the pore spaces between your soil particles, and you end up with smaller spaces for air and for water. So then you end up with less oxygen and obviously less water available for the trees, and also it's harder for the roots to go around. So there's the planning bit, and there's also the just unnecessary damage. For me, there's a lot of unnecessary damaging happening to trees, also in Orville, but everywhere around the world. And it's really because we don't understand the assets that we have. And so we're just going and doing it, and we think it's going to be fine. The trees are tough, and these are very tough trees. These trees and the rain trees, these are service trees. They're super tough trees. They can deal with a lot of stuff. but we're very lucky because they're still very young. And when you do stuff to a really young tree, it can deal with it. The minute it starts getting to a certain age and having a certain amount of ailments and conditions that it has to deal with, then it can't cope with all these things as much. So then you have decay coming in, and then you have a whole succession of different parasites and other organisms that will come in to slowly kill off your trees. So right now we're kind of okay, but the more we do this, the more we're going to have problems. So we're kind of like at a real limit right now where these trees are just not old enough to really show the damage that we're doing to them directly. A few of these trees are dying back, so it shows that they're stressed enough because the top branches are dying back, so it's creating a smaller canopy, which means it's not able to deal with as big a system. So it's creating a smaller system which it can maintain. So it is, some trees are exhibiting that, not all of them yet.
I have a question. What's the alternative?
So that's just what I was going to say. So there are alternatives in India as well. Trenchless technology, for example. So you bore with a hydraulic machine and you're putting in your pipes directly. Often the problem, and in this case, for example, this is utility. They're laying utilities here, but obviously in some cases they'll have to access the utilities. So it's just a case of, well, it's not just a case, it's a question of cash. It's a question of investment. If we lay in pipes to put in these utilities, then we can make sure that the utilities aren't damaged by the trees, and the trees aren't damaged by the utilities. So that was the existing tree stock, so what we've already got, and now this is new tree planting. So we need to plant more trees because some of our existing tree stocks are going to die, and also because we have a lot of space to put them. So the first thing we need to do is identify appropriate trees, and I've come up with a list, for example, for Oroville, which would be appropriate trees for the roadside trees. And appropriate trees for me are long-term trees, but also large trees. The larger the tree, the longer the tree, the more benefits it provides. So long-term trees. In Oroville itself, we really want to be looking more at evergreen trees. We have this thing where in the summer a lot of the trees lose their leaves, so we're not benefiting from this temperature change that the trees provide. So having evergreen trees, or in some cases, I mean, for example, the service tree, it's not an evergreen tree, the rain tree, same thing. They're brevely deciduous trees, so they're deciduous, but for a very short amount of time, and it's not in the full summer. So that's also fine, but we need to identify these trees and make sure those are the ones that are being planted. I spoke about pathogens, so diversity is one way to have a very resilient system. We have many, many different types of species of trees, of families of trees, of types of trees in India. A lot of them are drought resistant. A lot of them can deal with where we put them. It's again identifying what you're planting. The reason you want diversity is because, and it's been shown in the UK, it's been shown in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the US. You have epidemics that come through. You have the oak processionary moth. You have the Dutch elm disease, which some of you might have heard of, which basically it's one fungus or one bacteria, or in some cases it's insects which come through and they'll wipe out a whole species. So if you've planted service trees along a whole road, these guys will come in and they'll wipe out your 30-year-old service trees, which you've invested a lot of time and money in one swoop, basically. And you'll have to wait another 30 years before you get anything there. So this is building a more resilient future, and it can be a pretty one as well. Planting things such as these guys next to the roads is not a good idea because you're creating accidents. These are really dangerous fruits. They're this big, for those who don't know. They're really heavy. They're like a block of wood. You don't want to be driving under there. You don't want to get it on your head, and you don't want to drive on it because it's a serious chance of an accident. So it's likewise with mangoes. You want to plant the trees that are appropriate to the places where they're suitable. You can plant it in a park or at the edge of a park. You can put a fence around. You can do things, or where you have less people coming through. That's fine. That just needs to be taken into consideration. So trees need to be location and environment specific. Here, ideally, they really need to be drought resistant. If they're on the roads, they have to be drought resistant. You drive around and you see these trees covered in dust. they really have a really hard time. You've got people driving past. It doesn't matter how fast they're going, but every time a car or a vehicle passes a tree that's sort of this big, it's being desiccated. You're bringing wind to it, so it's evaporating the water the meager amount of water that it has already. So you want drought-resistant species here, basically. Rooting type is also really important. Here I've got, this is a silk cotton, the base of a silk cotton tree, so we're not so familiar with seeing these now, but a lot of the silk cottons that we have, they will eventually turn into this if they get older. If we have this next to the road, it's going to create a problem, basically, because they're going to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's important to know what you're planting for those reasons as well. Kaya senegalensis, we have a lot of those as well. They grow very big roots just at the surface. They can also become trip hazards. They can create quite a bit of destruction. So really important is the growing space of the tree, both above ground and below ground. This tree has obviously not been planted, but it really illustrates a point where this was really in the wrong place. So the soil volume determines the size of your tree. If you're planting a really big tree, you want really big soil volume. And these calculations are there. We can find them out based on the tree that we've got. If you've got too small soil volume, you'll end up with small trees, and in some cases, you'll end up killing those trees because they'll reach sort of the edge of their box, essentially, and then they'll die. We don't have that too much in Oroville now because we've got a lot of space along the roads, but if you're building in a city where you're sort of retrofitting trees into the sidewalks and that sort of thing, you're going to be really limited on soil volume. So you need to plant the appropriate trees for that space. Soil type is also very important, and the canopy volume and the type. If you're familiar with a rain tree, it grows really wide. It doesn't grow that tall, so it'll be 30 meters wide when it's 15 to 20 meters high. You have other trees which grow in a much more columnar way, so depending on where it is, if you have two buildings and you have a narrow space between them, you wouldn't plant something that'll go and interfere with those two buildings, because then you'll end up having to prune it. It doesn't fit. It's a waste of time and energy, basically. It's bad for the tree. This is for me an illustration of a well-placed tree. This is the Saracon campus. It's a tree that's buffering against rain. Obviously, it's providing a lot of shade. It's creating space under there that people can congregate in. They can, it's a much more, it's a softer landscape. It's essentially the centerpiece of the space. So it's really creating a space just by being there. If we're planting trees, we need to start with really good nursery stock. We end up with getting a lot of really big trees from nurseries, which have been grown in pots that are too small. So if you don't transplant a tree or a plant from one pot to another as it grows in the right amount of time, you end up getting circling roots. You can see the roots in there, they're all going and spiraling around. And what happens eventually is that you'll end up getting girdling roots. This is a 10-meter tall tree, which is probably around 30 years old. It's about 50, 70 centimeters diameter, and it's fallen down because you can see here, there are no lateral roots. It's been girdled by a root. You have the tree stem like that, it's been girdled by the roots going that way. So it's stopping the vessels from being able to function. So it's weakening it, so health-wise, physiologically, but it's also preventing roots from going laterally out here. So this whole side of the tree didn't have any lateral roots. And it's really compromised in structure, and it's just come down because of that reason, basically. So it's a 30-year investment for not much, basically. So girdling roots, good form. Ideally, obviously, when we're looking for trees in nurseries, we're often looking for a good central leader. And the reason for that is you'll have less conflicts between the branches. It doesn't mean it's always the case, but if you're going in that direction, if you're looking for things that have a good form, then you'll end up with trees that require less maintenance in the future. Also, you have a lot of trees that in some cases, or you have some instances of trees where there's a genetic defect in the tree. So for example, you'll have branches. It's very important that the branch unions are well formed. You'll have some cases where you have branch unions that are formed that are very weak because of a defect, a genetic defect. And what you've got sometimes is you've got a whole load of trees that have been taken from the seeds of one tree, which have this defect, and these guys all get planted on a street, and when the trees get to a certain size, they start shedding their branches, because they've got this defect, this inherent defect. So if you avoided that, you would have avoided a lot of problems. Yeah, there's also planting at the right depth. Often the case is that trees are planted too deep. If you plant a tree too deep, what can result is the girdling roots, but also you'll have, instead of having roots coming out from just the ground level, just under the ground level, going laterally, they'll be going, because they're lower down, they'll be going out and they'll be going up and like that, because they're trying to get more oxygen also, in some cases, not always. But then you end up with a weakened structure, essentially. An engineer is looking for as straight as possible systems, basically. Every time you have a bend in the system, then you're creating a weak spot. And if you've got lots of bends and you have a lot of weak spots, so the tree then needs to put on more wood, so it's using more energy to keep itself up. So it's wasting energy, essentially. So you get weaker trees. And also they might be more in contact with soil-borne bacteria, which can then go into the stem, rather than which would be in contact only with the roots, which have a different epidermis, essentially. So this is going back to the utilities, but also, so we end up with getting a lot of conflicts between roots and utilities and structures, and vice versa. And this is obviously something that needs to be really incorporated from the start. So if we plan to plant trees in certain places, we need to make sure those trees don't come in conflict with whatever is going to go there. That's not always easy to predict, especially in Orville, where we have no idea what's going to happen. But we can have an idea, and we can sort of talk to each other to make sure we've got some sort of direction where we're going, so that we're not directly in conflict. And then we can say, well, this was agreed by all the parties involved, based on these decisions, and then we can sort of move forward with that. So we can employ things like, for example, pipes for the utilities. We can use root barriers. For example, if you want to avoid the roots going under the pavers, for example, here, the pavers often have a layer of sand. That's perfect for tree roots to go under. So if we put a root barrier there, then we'll be stopping this potential damage that would be occurring to the root, to the roads and to the roots, because if a big lorry comes onto that root, then it's also damaging the roots. A very easy and cheap thing to do to get healthier trees is to mulch, because of a variety of reasons. One of them is obviously it's keeping the water that's already there. It's also improving the percolation. It's regulating the pH, because there's more biomass, so it's being a buffer. So there's less. It's harder to change the pH of the soil. Also, with regards to percolation rates are improved. What else? You've got more microorganisms, because the temperature is more regulated, so it gets less hot during the day, and you're keeping down weeds. And in some cases, it can actually look good, like on the top picture, I think. And you can also do that, for example, with porous pavement. So it's pavement that allows water to go in, but it's still covering the base, so it's acting as mulch as well. So that's rounding up, basically. So my key point, it's plan with the trees in mind. We really need to think green infrastructure complements grey infrastructure. It's not grey infrastructure and then we'll put in some plants, because it doesn't work. And we can get so many more benefits from having trees in place to be complementing and enhancing this great infrastructure. We really need to manage our trees properly, because we'll know what budget we need, we'll know what we have, we'll know what we can go forward to, we know what benefits they're providing. They're really helping us to evaluate what we've got and where we're going. And we really need to stop damaging trees unnecessarily, because this is really something that's easy to do, and it's really unnecessary. We're wasting our time, essentially, by damaging our assets. They're huge assets, and people need to realize this, that it's not just a tree, it's not just street furniture. It's actually part of the infrastructure of the urban space. So the last slide is we're doing this because we're thinking in the long term, and we're not going to do that if we're planting trees and cutting them out in 10 years or damaging them, basically. We're only going to get these benefits later on. So we really need to plant the future. So that's it. Thank you very much. Any more information you want, or to get references, or to collaborate, that's me, island@treescapes.in. Thank you very much.